Okay, so good morning. We're ready to study Genesis some more here at Santa Cruz Community Church. I'm John Heberling, retired pastor and teacher of the scriptures. So, the book of Genesis is about the patriarchs, I've said before, and I want to say again. And really, the main story is Abraham. Abraham is the beginner of it all. And so we wanted to be sure as we were studying it that we got Abraham in his right place. And I had said, be careful what you do with these Genesis stories. You don't want to try to judge the Genesis people on exactly the same standards that we judge with as all the teaching we've had as New Testament people. But on the other hand, you don't want to ignore the fact that this is God dealing with people. And part of the reason I think why we want to study Genesis is we want to have this way of getting better acquainted with God. And you don't want to jump to conclusions of what you think God is doing, but you want to look carefully at what God is doing and how. And then we have Abraham and Isaac, and then we reach Jacob, and Jacob has lots more story. And I think in lots of ways the essence of the experience with the patriarchs turns on Jacob and his stories. And I'm aware that when we look at Jacob, we're not only learning more about how God deals with people, but we're learning more about people, and in a way it's a way of reflecting on our own attitudes. So to get us into our story, I would suggest that you read yourself, because sometimes I read the text and sometimes I just kind of tell the story. So Jacob, last time we had the beginning of Jacob and Esau, the twins, born as sons of Isaac and Rebekah. We had the idea that we waited a long time, not as long as with Abraham and Sarah, but we waited a long time before the twins were born. And having twins, and these were very active twins before they were born, tells us something interesting about that. And so Rebekah was kind of at her wit's end with all this movement within her, and so she talks to God about it, and in her case, God talks back. She says, what's going on here? And God says, well, you have, actually, not only do you have two boys in you, twins, but you actually have two nations, two destinies within you. And he tells her, kind of gives her a little insight. He says, the older of your two sons will serve the younger. Now, this is a dramatic difference from the usual. The usual is that the oldest son is the one who carries on the family, becomes the responsible person in the family. It's interesting studying Genesis on Sunday morning and studying Romans on Wednesday evening, because if you remember reading Romans, or if you're in that class on Wednesday evening, you see that Paul takes a lot of his reasoning about things back from Genesis. And in fact, I hadn't thought about it. Pastor Dan and I have talked over the years about how things we discuss at the Sunday school hour seem to connect with things he discusses in the sermon. And last time, talking about Jesus and the woman at the well in Samaria, you remember she says, well, this is Jacob's well. And if Jacob drank from it and we drink from it, that's all we need. And when Jesus talks to her, she finally says to him, you think you're greater than our father Jacob? Well, that's an interesting question, isn't it? So, the two boys are born, and Esau is born first, and is kind of a hairy person at birth, and I guess all through his life. And Jacob is anthropology I learned we would say he's hirsute. He has a lot of hair, and Jacob does not. So, and Esau becomes a man's man. He's out hunting game. He's wandering around. He's doing his own thing. Jacob stays close to home, and so we have this that we can recognize as a parenting problem that Esau takes up with, or Jacob takes up with Esau as his favorite. It's very clear that Esau is his favorite, and Rebekah takes up with Jacob as her favorite, and it's very clear that Jacob is her favorite. And so we have this pull apart of the family. Now, Isaac is aging and his eyesight is failing. He's not really as close to death as he seems to think he is. And we follow this story that Jacob is staying close to home and is learning to cook, and I guess Esau learns to cook too, but Esau barbecues and Jacob cooks in the kitchen. That's a modern interpretation. Anyway, Esau has had a bad time hunting, and he comes back. There's no game for him to cook on out there in the trail, so he's famished. He's hungry. He thinks he's starving to death. And Jacob is cooking some lentil stew. Some have said it's sort of Old Testament chili. Anyway, he's cooking this stew that appears red in color. And Esau says, "Give me some of your stew. I'm about to die of hunger." And Jacob says, "Well, sell me your birthright, your right to be the first son, the leading son." And Esau says, "What good's a birthright when I'm dying?" So he says, "Give me some soup." And Jacob says, "Tell me first, you're selling me the birthright." "Okay, you can have the birthright." And the text makes this comment that so Esau despised his birthright. It meant nothing to him. He didn't care about it, but it meant a lot to Jacob. Now, we're going to try to cover enough of Jacob's life today that rather than me interpreting it for you, I want to just draw you into this story, and I would suggest that you ponder this and say, what am I supposed to learn from this story of Jacob? What do I learn about God? What do I learn about people? And we'll talk about that more next week. So anyway, now Isaac is getting old and his eyesight is failing, and he says to Esau, "Go and fix me one of your dinners, one of your meals of the good game that you catch, and bring it to me, and we'll have this father and son traditional time, and I will give you the family blessing." This goes with the birthright. And he goes out to hunt. Esau goes out to hunt game. Everything's between he and his father is understood. Meanwhile, Rebekah is listening to this conversation. It's a nice thing about living in tents is that you can hear what goes on in the other tent. She calls Jacob and she says, "You go and bring me a couple of young goats, and I'll fix a dinner. You take the dinner in, and you get the blessing." And Jacob says, "Yeah, this isn't going to work, Mom. Esau's a hairy guy, and I'm not. Dad isn't going to be fooled. He's going to know that it's not Esau, that it's me." She says, "You just do what I tell you, son. I got this all under control." So she fixes the meal. She takes the goat skin and puts it on his hands and on his neck, and she dresses him in some of Esau's clothes that are there in the family tents. So Jacob does what she says. He goes in, and his somewhat blind father says, "Who's that?" "Well, it's Esau, your son." And Jacob says, "Really?" Isaac says, "Really?" And so he it strings out, and you can tell Isaac is confused by this. And finally Isaac, we're told in the text that Isaac is saying to himself, "I don't understand this. The voice is Jacob's, but he smells like Esau. He feels like Esau. He says he's Esau." So he gives him the blessing. Jacob gathers up his stuff and leaves, and just as he does, here comes Esau in, and he says, "Hey, Dad, here I am with the meal. Give me the blessing." And Isaac says, "Who are you?" And he says, "Well, I'm Esau, your son." "Well, then who was that I just gave the blessing to?" It Esau now is really disturbed by this. He says, "Well, you gave him the blessing. Don't you have any blessing for me?" And Isaac says, "Yes, I'll bless you. You'll be an important person. You'll have your own family, but your brother, you will serve your brother." And he does have this hint that at some time you will throw off your brother's yoke. You will stand up against him. And of course, historically, if you read through the rest of the Bible, you see that Esau becomes the nation of Edom. Esau means red, Edom means red. Sometimes behind the words there are interesting things. And Edom becomes the enemy nation to Israel, to such an extent that the prophets talk about Edom, because when the Babylonians finally came and tore down the temple in Jerusalem and carried the people away captive, the Edomites came out to their border and watched this procession and cheered. And so the prophet said, well, Edom is not going to survive. And of course, go visit Edom today? No, because there is no such nation today. What happens to these people? Well, they blend into the cultures that we do see today. But anyway, then Esau says, and again it's overheard by his mother, she doesn't miss anything, Rebecca. He says, okay, so Jacob has taken my birthright and my blessing, but when father dies, I'm going to kill him. I'm going to kill my brother. That'll fix it. So Rebecca says, well, we can't have that. So she goes to Isaac and says, Esau has married a couple of these Canaanite women, 2 of them, and she says, they're just driving me crazy. If Jacob marries one of these Canaanite women, what in the world will I do? And Isaac says, I think you're right. I think Jacob should go back to the family, like Abraham sent his servant back to the family to bring you to be my wife. Jacob should go back to the family and find a wife there, a better, suitable wife. So, where we left off last time, Jacob is heading up all by himself, and he goes a day's journey, and he ends up kind of in the middle of the land of Canaan, and kind of close to where Abraham landed as he was coming from the other direction, and sort of said, I'm here, this is the land that God was talking about. The text says he came to a certain place, and he lays down for the night, and in the night he has this glorious dream. Now, I said, and I think still it's that you should put yourself in Jacob's place. He's been a homeboy, and all of a sudden home is back there and he's leaving, not knowing will he ever get back home. So that's his state of mind. And in the dream, he puts a rock down and puts his head on it. We think, that's an odd pillow. I wouldn't be very comfortable sleeping with my head on a rock. But maybe he put padding over the rock or whatever. Anyway, he sees this dream in which there's a stairway. I think the King James says a ladder, but more of a stairway leading from earth to heaven. And when he looks up at the top of the stairs stands a figure that represents God. Now, all through the Old Testament, we want to keep remembering that the New Testament says very clearly that no human eyes can really see God. God is not flesh and blood like we are. God is not made out of material stuff. God is a spirit. So human eyes cannot see God. And further, it says God is so powerful and so such a great person that he dwells in impenetrable light. Nobody can really get that close to God. So what we see always is God coming down and associating with people in his own way. So up at the top of this ladder stands God, and up and down the ladder go the angels. The angels become very significant in Jacob's life. Jacob wakes up in the morning. He says, wow, this is the house of God. Bethel. Bethel means the house of God. And the place comes to be named Bethel, as we'll see. And so he says, okay, God speaks to him in the dream and says, I will take care of you the way I took care of Abraham, your grandfather, and Isaac, your father. I will take care of you. I will give you this land. I will multiply your descendants. And Jacob says, well, if God's going to do that, God says, I'll bring you back home. And that's very important to Jacob. If God's going to bring me back home, then I will serve God, and I'll give him 1/10 of everything I own. We never see him how he does that. If he doesn't, we're never told. But anyway, so he goes on his way, and we're not told anything more about his journey except that he arrives, and I feel like he knew where he was going. The servant of Abraham didn't quite know where he was going. He had to depend upon God to lead him. Jacob knows where he's going because it's where his mother came from, and she can tell him where it is. So he goes there, and he finds he's outside the city of Haran where they live, and there are shepherds there with their sheep, and Jacob asks them, where are you guys from? Well, we're from Haran. Oh, you know Laban? Laban is Rebekah's brother, and you know that family? Oh yeah. Well, how's Laban doing? Oh, he's fine. He's doing very well. In fact, there, see those sheep coming? You see that shepherd with them? That's his daughter Rachel. And Jacob is very moved by this. He helps her water her sheep, which means moving a rock that covers this artesian well spring. And she takes him home, and Laban says, oh, your family, come right in, Jacob. Now this relationship between Jacob and Laban becomes the next story. So he stays there a month as kind of a guest in the house. Now, Jacob will later say, when I came, I had nothing except the staff that was in my hand. Maybe he had some clothes or something, but he had no possessions. It was just he himself. So Laban says to him after about a month, well, you're my relative, and I'm glad to have you here, but I don't know whether Jacob has been working for Laban or whether Laban is suggesting that he should be working. Think about relationships with teenagers, young men. Laban says, just because you're my relative doesn't mean you should work for me for nothing. So tell me, what wages do you want? He's saying, Jacob, you're going to stay here, you're going to work. I'll define what your job is. You tell me what wages you want. And Jacob says, I want your daughter, Rachel. I'll work for you 7 years. Now, it was customary already, I'm told, in those days, that a father had raised a bride to age to be married, and so the groom or the groom's family paid a bride price, a dowry. And I'm told that the custom was that the dowry was supposed to be sort of an investment, that the bride's family kept this money, and should anything go wrong, and the bride needs help down the road as a widow, and this money would be drawn upon. But in Laban's case, he spent the money. I mean, there was no cash. Jacob was working for him for 7 years. And now everything belongs to Laban. Jacob has nothing. He's tending these sheep, and Laban evidently is not a terribly prosperous man at this time. So after the 7 years, you know the story. This was part of last week's lesson. Jacob says, I've worked the 7 years, now give me my bride. And Laban says, okay, we'll have the wedding feast. I suppose it went deep into the night, and I presume everybody's enjoying their wine and their meal. And so there's the bridal room prepared. And Jacob says, okay, go into your wife. But in the morning when he wakes up, it's not Rachel that he has there, it's Leah. Now you can figure that one out any way you want. And the text tells us that Rachel was beautiful, but Leah had, it says, weak eyes. There's all kinds of comments about what that really meant. Cow's eyes, nice, sad eyes. But it basically meant Rachel is beautiful and Leah is not. So Jacob is angry with his uncle, and he says, you've tricked me, you've cheated me. And the uncle says, well, it's our custom that the oldest woman in the family should be married first. But if you work another 7 years, I'll give you Rachel. And if I read the text rightly, they went right ahead with the second wedding, and he married Rachel. And then he worked the 7 years. So now the 7 years are up. And during those 7 years, we have a growing family here. Leah immediately begins to have children, boys. And when they tell me it's the custom that when a woman is married, her primary nurse or companion, servant girl, is given to her as part of her dowry, part of her what the family provides her. So each of these girls came with a nurse. And when Leah has had several children and Rachel hasn't had any children, Rachel says, this goes back to kind of what we saw with Sarah and Abraham. She says, well, I'm not having children, but I need to have children. So because you read the story, you see Leah realizes that she's not really the loved wife, and that bothers her. There's a competition immediately between these sisters. And each time she has a child, Leah says, well, now my husband will love me. And this goes on for 3 children at least. So then Rachel gives her nurse to Jacob. And I don't think we should see Jacob as some kind of a wild and crazy man here. This was just what the customs around them were. And he has 2 children by that nurse. And then Leah says, well, if that's the game, then I'm not having children right now either. I'll give my nurse to Jacob. She does, my servant. And he has 2 more sons from that one. So all these children are being born. Can you imagine that household with all these children? And Jacob, meanwhile, is tending Laban's flocks. And as he tends Laban's flocks, the flocks are growing. Laban is becoming wealthy. Now, finally, and you're going to have to interpret this for yourself, how much God is involved in the exact details here. But we're told that that Rachel is asking God, where are my children? And finally God, it says, took pity on Rachel, and she has a child. She names him Joseph. We'll hear a lot more about him. And as soon as Joseph is born, and the 14 years are up now, Jacob says, well, I think I'm going back home. And Laban says, oh, Jacob, don't do that. We have such a good thing going here. Tell me what wages do you want, and stay and continue to tend my things. And so Jacob decides to stay. Now, God doesn't seem to be having any input at this point. So then they make a contract. And this becomes really strange. And you just read this and tell me when I was in college, we got together and debated how in the world we'd understand this text. I still don't understand it. So Jacob says to Laban, I'll tell you what, sometimes in the sheep and the goats, they're off color. sheep are supposed to be white, but sometimes they're black, sometimes they're kind of half and half, spotted, streaked. I'll take those bad ones, those streaked ones, those black sheep. You can have all the good sheep. Laban says, I like that. That sounds good. Okay, we'll do it. And all of a sudden, all the sheep begin to be born black and streaked, and the goats streaked. And then Jacob does something. He takes pieces of wood, tells us what kind of wood, and he peels the bark off so that part of it is dark with the bark and part of it is light with the inside wood. And he puts it in the watering troughs and he puts it out there. And the sheep see those branches and they all have offspring that are miscolored. Really? My college friends and I said, really? Would that work? I don't think so. So we said, what are the possibilities? Maybe in that the particular wood he used had some kind of chemical thing that it got in the water. We decided that isn't what the text says. The text says the sheep saw the wood. So we said, at another point in it, it says that Jacob saw that always the strongest. Now, if you were a farmer raising cattle now, what would be your way of doing this? You would say, I'm going to buy, I've got Holstein cattle here. I'm going to buy a Holstein bull that's of the best quality, and that's going to raise the level of my herd. So we're told that Jacob figured out the stronger animals were bred for his people, his flocks. I'm thinking, okay, so Jacob really understood this matter of raising animals that farm people have always understood. But it really doesn't explain. And then later Jacob says about Laban and to Laban, you changed the contract 10 times. It seems like Laban has other children growing up. The 2 girls were the oldest, but he has boys coming along. And he and his boys are looking and they're saying, every year Jacob has more animals and we have less. What's going on here? So Laban says, well, maybe we ought to reverse it. Maybe I'll keep the spotted ones and you take, 10 times he changes the contract. But every time he does, whatever contract he makes, Jacob comes out stronger. And this goes on for 6 years. Now we come to the end of the 6 years, and God says to Jacob, it's time to go home. So Jacob says, I think I need to go home. I want to go home. But what about Laban? So he says, I'm just going to go. He calls his wives and he says, come out and talk to me out in the field. So your father and his kid, and your brothers don't hear what's being said. He said, we're gonna leave. So he puts them on, the wives and the children on camels, and they start going. 3 days later, somebody says, where's Jacob and his family and all the flocks? They're gone. They rush to Laban and say, do you know that Jacob left? And Laban says, really? So now, get the picture here. Jacob is an outsider in this area. Laban and his family have been living here for 3 or 4 generations. So all the neighbors are on whose side? Laban's. So he gathers up a bunch of the neighbor guys and they get on their donkeys or camels or whatever, and they go chasing Jacob. Now, we're told that Jacob crossed the river, and I looked at a map and I think this was the upper arm of the Euphrates that he crossed. And he's headed back into that land that we call Canaan or Palestine, back into the Holy Lands. But he's moving slowly. He's got all the little kids and flocks, and so Laban, with more of a military attachment, it looks like, catches up with him finally. And they're in when the Israelites finally come into this land, they discover that that the Jordan Valley is one kind of land, but up here is this tableland that's great pasture land, and that's where Jacob is coming into now, and Laban finds him. And there's kind of a confrontation. Now, there's one more thing about this, and that is we're told that Rachel stole the household gods. What's that about? Well, I read my archaeologists, they say, well, everybody had household gods. In fact, today, if you were in Japan, you have a god shelf, and on this god shelf you put the representations of the gods that are important. In Japan today, and back then, I think, often the gods had to do with the family heritage. They had to do with grandpa and great-grandpa and all that. But anyway, they would put this together. They would get some gold, silver. They would make this little idol thing. I say little, I don't know how big it was. This was the household god, and it kind of went to that oldest son as a kind of a symbol of who was in charge of the household. So these gods are called, I think, teraphim or something. Anyway, Rachel stole this family god that was how much is Rachel involved in the idolatrous kind of thinking that goes with this, or how much is she just saying, hey, we daughters are really the inheritors of this family. It's all about us and our kids and our husband, and so we're taking this valuable thing. Anyway, Laban catches up with Jacob and he says, you took my daughters and my grandkids, you didn't ask me, you took all these sheep really are really mine, It doesn't matter what contract and what happened over the years, they're really my sheep, and you took them, my goats and my camels and everything. So, and Jacob says, yeah, I arrived here with just a staff in my hand, and now I'm leaving with all this wealth. So Laban says you shouldn't have done that, and there's definitely a thread about this. Laban's got these people with him. Jacob's got some herdsmen and stuff, but nothing to match what Laban has with him. And Laban is threatening him. I'm going to take what's mine and take it back. And what am I going to do to you? Who knows? But as Laban was on his way chasing Jacob, he has this encounter with God. Now, God and Laban don't seem to be that close of an association, and yet Laban knows that about this God that was Abraham's God. At one point, Laban talks about our gods back the generations, and he finally gets back to great-grandpa Terah, who we're told clearly was an idolater, and yet he's saying all of our gods way back to great-grandpa. Anyway, Jacob knows nothing about this. Rachel did this. Jacob doesn't know anything about it. So Jacob says, I didn't take anything of yours. All this, he said, you changed our contract 10 times over, and yet what I have here is everything that I earned that was mine by contract. And these are my wives, and I paid for them with my labor, so I took nothing of yours. And Laban says, well, but why did you take my gods? And Jacob said, I didn't take your gods. And he says, if you find your gods with anybody here, they'll pay the price of death with it. We're thinking, oh my gosh, Rachel has the gods. So now this is an interesting story, especially you ladies would appreciate this. So Jacob says, search. If you find your gods, we've got all these witnesses here. You show me. So Laban goes into Jacob's tent. He doesn't find anything that belongs to him. He goes into Leah's tent, the two servant girls' tents. Finally, he comes to Rachel's tent. Notice how this works out to be, And Rachel takes the gods that she stole. Now, they're riding on camels, and these camels have a saddle, big framed saddle that sits on the back of the camel. So she puts the god under this saddle, So it gives you an idea of how big this God would be. And she sits on the saddle, and her father comes in and she says, I'm sorry, Dad, her dad, I'm sorry, Dad, I can't get up because I'm having my period. Now that's what our English translation says. I'm not sure what the Hebrew says. I'm not a Hebrew scholar. But in essence, that's what she's saying. It's the way of women. I can't get up. And that was understood, and it was something to be done. So Laban says, well, of course not, dear. You just stay where you are. He searches. He doesn't find the gods. So now Jacob's in his face. He says, well, where are the gods that I stole? And Laban says, find them. So finally Laban says, okay. Your God warned me not to do anything or even say anything dangerous to you, so I'm going home. So then they do this thing. This area is called Gilead in the Hebrew language, but it's also called Mizpah, and Mizpah means tower. So Jacob sets up a rock like he did at Bethel, and has a kind of a ceremony of giving to God and pours oil on the rock, and then he tells his family, gather up stones and pile them up and make stone piles. And then he and Laban make a contract, and they have a dinner together. It's very nice. And they say this wonderful thing. When I was a teenager, we would have our youth meetings, and at the end of the youth meeting, we would join hands all around a circle, and we would say the Mizpah benediction. Did you do that? Now the Lord watch between me and thee while we're absent one from another. Beautiful. Then I read this story and I find out, no, the Mizpah benediction was Laban and Jacob saying, this is the contract. This marks the barrier between your place and my place. You don't cross this barrier and come give me any trouble, and I won't cross this barrier and give you any trouble. That's how the Lord is going to watch between us while we're absent one from another. So the piles of stones and the rock pillar are to mark this border between your place and my place. So Laban goes back home, and that's it. We don't have any dealings with him anymore. Life goes on back there the way it did. But Jacob starts on home, and as he starts home, something occurs to him. Incidentally, we talked about the angels. Jacob sees a company of angels. I don't know whether this was in a vision or dream, or whether he looked up and he just saw these mysterious people, but he sees a company of angels, and he takes this as a sign from God that all is well. So he moves on, and then he says, but I'm not only going home to Isaac and Rebekah, I'm going home to Esau. And Esau said he was going to kill me. So what's going to happen now? So he's moving his family closer and closer. So finally he says, okay, I'm going to find some servants that can travel fast here, and I'm going to send them to go and tell Esau that I'm coming, and we'll see what's going to happen here. But he doesn't know what's going to happen. He's afraid. So he sends this person, and the person comes back and says, yeah, I told Esau you were coming, and Esau is coming to meet you with 400 men with him. And Jacob says, oh my gosh, I don't have any military might here, and he's coming with 400 men. He's established himself in what later becomes the country of Edom, and he's generations have passed, and he's got people working for him, and so he's got these 400 men. So now Jacob says, well, I better be peaceable with my brother. I better do everything I can to appease him. So he takes a group of animals, the best of his animals, and he puts some servants with him, and he says, you go on ahead of us, and when you meet Esau coming with his 400 men, and he says, who are you? You say, we're Jacob's servants. And this is a present from Jacob to his brother Esau. And that's exactly what happens. Esau says, who are you? And they said, and Jacob is coming to meet you. And Esau says, I don't want his stuff. I've got plenty of stuff of my own. But Jacob doesn't know this. So Esau keeps coming. And finally, he looks up and he sees, I don't know whether he sees the dust rising from the animals coming, or he sees that a way off that Esau is now here. So he divides up the family, and he first sends the handmaidens and their 4 sons over the river first to meet Esau. Then he sends Leah and her, I think she has 5 sons now. There's another interesting story that we didn't talk about that maybe we'll go back and talk about. That at one point, the oldest son of Leah goes out and he finds some mandrakes. Now, I don't know what mandrakes are that much, but they were supposed to be a fertility thing. I don't know whether there's some science behind this or whether it's just... And anyway, so he comes in, he brings his mother these mandrakes. And Rachel says, oh, give me some mandrakes. And Leah says to Rachel, you stole my husband and now you want my son's mandrakes also? And Leah says, oh, yeah, I really want some of those mandrakes, you know. This is before she's had children. And Leah says, okay, I'll tell you what. You take the mandrakes, but I'll take Jacob. He sleeps with me now. And Rachel says, okay. So Jacob is coming in from a hard day's work and Leah meets him and says, I bought you with my son's mandrakes. You belong to me. This wonderful family stuff here. So anyway, that's a past story. So now everything's gone over this little river, the Jabbok River, that you can see on the map that comes down and flows into the Jordan. And they're coming down the east side of the Jordan through this pasture land. And Esau is coming. And so Jacob is left alone on his side of the Jabbok River, all by himself. And suddenly there appears someone who wrestles with him. All night they wrestle. And Jacob cannot win this match, nor does the stranger win. And so as dawn is approaching, and they're doing this in the dark, so Jacob can't really see this being. The stranger reaches out and tabs him on the hip, and his hip goes out of joint. And of course now he only has 1 leg instead of 2, and so the stranger is going to win the battle. And so Jacob grabs onto the stranger and he says, I won't let you go unless you bless me. And the stranger says, what's your name? And Jacob says, my name is Jacob. He says, no, now your name will be Israel. And Jacob says, what's your name? And he says, why are you asking my name? So anyway, the dawn comes and the stranger disappears. And Jacob limps over the river and limps off. And Esau runs and throws his arms around him and says, oh, my long-lost brother, I'm so glad to see you. I love you so much. And everything's just fine. And then Esau says, okay, come on, come back with me, back to my place. And Jacob says, well, no, you know, you can travel fast, but I can't travel fast with the young kids and the young animals. And you go ahead, I'll meet you later there. So Esau finally agrees and he goes. And Jacob says, now we're not following Esau, we're going across the Jordan back into the main part of the land. And he goes back. Now there's another little episode that we'll talk about next week, where they come to this city of Shechem, which is apparently a family kind of city. And there's one girl. Can you imagine being the one girl with all these 11 brothers? And so there's one girl, Dinah, who I presume is attractive like the other girls in this family. So they're outside this city of Shechem, and the prince of the city, the son of the guy who's the head of the city, sees this girl, Dinah, and he wants her and he takes her. And so the brothers say, boy, this can't be. We can't let our sister be mishandled this way. So they, instead of them standing up for it another, they say, okay, I tell you, the brother says, well, I really want to marry her. And the head of the family says, yeah, you have lots of flocks and we can just be one big happy family here. You have lots of boys, we all have girls they can marry. And so they say, well, we can't marry you and you can't marry our sister because we're all circumcised and your men are not circumcised. So if the men are all circumcised, then we could probably do this. So the men of the city get together and they say, well, it's a good deal. Look at all the flocks this guy has. So, all right, so all the men are circumcised. Well, for a couple of days, they're pretty much laid low with this operation at their time of life. And so then the sons of Jacob the oldest ones take their swords and they go and they kill all these guys who can't fight back because they're in pain from being circumcised. And Jacob says, what have you done? The whole area now is going to have this story and they're going to all fall on us and slaughter us. And the text says, but God put the fear of God into the people. And so Jacob moves on and nobody attacks him. But later we'll find out that Jacob says to these boys, what you did costs you your place in the inheritance. You can't be the chief inheritors because of what you did. Anyway, then the next chapter is the very interesting chapter. Jacob says, we're going back to where I saw the vision of heaven. And so I want you to put away all the foreign gods. We have the idea here that a lot of these people have these foreign idol gods. Jacob says, give them to me. And he buries them or burns them. He gets rid of them. And he says, I want you to change your clothes. I want you to get in the right spirit here. We're going back to Bethel and we're making a commitment to the Lord. So they go back to Bethel and Jacob builds an altar and he makes a commitment to the Lord at Bethel. And now this is where we're going to stop for today. But I want you to evaluate what do you see that's good about Jacob? We would say, in our way of dealing, we would say, oh my gosh, Jacob found God. Jacob has become a believer. Well, is that what happened? Or did God find Jacob? Paul says God picked Jacob out before he was born. So Paul's point is that Jacob did not earn God's favor. God favored him because he picked him out. And it's God who builds this relationship. It's not Jacob. It's not Jacob who found God. It's God who chose Jacob, who found him. So watch how this happens. Do we have the idea that God sometimes sets these things up to where something looks so devastating to us, and we're just beside ourselves, and then God does something that straightens it all out. And sometimes people make commitments to God, and then when it's all straightened out, it's like, I love these old stories that I learned when that this guy is on the roof, and he begins to slip down the roof, and he can see he's going to fall off the roof and kill himself. So he prays, and he says, God, help me. And then all of a sudden there's a nail there, and it catches on his pants. And he says, never mind, God, I was saved by this nail. or the other one of there's a flood, and the guy's on the housetop, and he's saying, oh, God, save me. And there comes a boat, and he says, no, I don't need a boat. God is going to save me. And then there comes a helicopter, and I don't need that. God is going to save me. And then finally the flood drowns him, and he says to God, why didn't you save me? And God said, I sent a boat and a helicopter. So anyway, what do you make of this? Interestingly, the word Israel, which then God talks to Jacob later and says, no, your name isn't Jacob anymore, it's Israel. The very dramatic name change. Abraham goes from Abram to Abraham. Not much of a change that we can see, and from exalted father to the father of multitudes. But Jacob means a crook, somebody who's sneaky, and Jacob fits that. Would you buy a used car from this guy? Jacob seems like a crook.
Or a used goat.
A used goat, a used camel. So anyway, if you buy a horse from him, you better count the teeth. So, and then all of a sudden he's named Israel. What does Israel mean? Israel means wrestling with God. And Jacob says, I have fought with God and have survived. So who is this person that wrestles with him? Well, we say it was an angel. I think I mentioned earlier that every time there's one of these things where it's God in some human form, it's more than an angel, like the one who spoke to Abraham about Sodom and Gomorrah, and it says Abraham remained before God. Or who was it that was in the flame with 3 Hebrew children? You say, well, this was always Jesus. When God appears in fleshly form, it's always a pre-visit of Jesus. That's a very devotional thought. So is it Jesus who wrestles with Jacob all night? Is it an angel? We know it's not the eternal spirit God, and yet whoever it is has the authority of God and the power of God. And Jacob says, I wrestled with God and prevailed. He wrestled with God, and he was able to survive the night. And it seemed then to fix, he had this fear of Esau, but after he wrestles with God, he goes unafraid to meet Esau, and of course it's all right. God has already taken care of that. Some parable kind of things here. So you think about that, and next week we want to talk about the further adventures of Jacob, but pretty soon it becomes Jacob's children. Now it's interesting that when we talk about who are these people, even to this day, they're Israelis. It's Israel. They are the children of Abraham, but the name that sticks to them is this name Israel, wrestled with God and prevailed. You see, Abraham has one promised son, and Paul makes a big thing of that. Isaac has 2 children, but God picks the younger one, and the other one doesn't count. So we have 2 generations where God picks one person to carry it on. Now we have 12 sons, because there is another son to be born in next week's lesson. And these 12 sons are the beginning of a larger family, a clan, and then a nation. So you see, it does turn on Jacob. Jacob, the grandson, becomes the one who begins this family process, this nation process. So who is this Jacob? Is he really always Jacob, in his dealings with Laban? He's always I can work this out. I can make a deal. And in a way, his deals seem to work, but do they work because God works them? And then finally, he can't make a deal with Esau. He tries. He says, I'll send him presents and that'll fix it. But he doesn't know that it did fix it. So when it finally comes down to it, he has to face Esau. And he faces Esau because he now seems to understand that God is taking care of this. And so he says, we have to go back to Bethel. We have to make a recommitment to God. We have to go back. And last thing, you're reading your Gospels, and you're reading the Gospel of John, and you're in this first chapter, and Jesus is picking out some men to be his followers. And there's this guy Nathaniel who is brought to Jesus, and he says, Jesus from Nazareth? Can anything good come from Nazareth? And Jesus says of him, here is a true Israelite in whom there is nothing false. And Nathanael says, how do you know anything about me? And Jesus said, I saw you under the tree and under the fig tree. And Nathanael says, you saw me under the fig tree? He sees this isn't possible. He says, oh, you must be the Son of God. And Jesus says, you believe because I told you that I saw you under the fig tree? You shall see greater things than that. Then he added, I tell you the truth, you shall see heaven open and the angels of God ascending and descending on the Son of Man. What's that about? Seems to be about Jacob's stairway, doesn't it? So, what is this stairway to heaven? Is this stairway to heaven a kind of an idea that God is going to come to you? You can't go to God, but God will come to you. You know, they tried to build that tower that would reach heaven. God's now saying, no, I will have to come to you, but I will come to you. And Jesus says, now we don't see any time in Jesus' life when he becomes this ladder, but we see that always in his life he is becoming the ladder by which God reaches man. And the angels are part of this, but they're always under his control. So, interesting. Think about Jacob this week. Go back and read those texts and see what you make of the things that they say. And we'll wrap it up next week. And then all of a sudden there comes in this family this son Joseph. And everything now shifts from Abraham and Isaac and Jacob to Joseph and the 12. So that's next week. So let's close in prayer. Father, we thank you for these thoughts that you have left with us of ancient history, and yet they're ancient and yet they're so real in our own experiences today. We see that what's important in our lives is that you have come to us and you have given us assurances and you have taken us to yourself. So we just pray that you would give us this understanding that Jesus became the way of moving from earth to heaven, the gateway of heaven. So give us your blessing as we fellowship and as we worship today. In Jesus' name, amen.